Yep.
Just where I got my glasses on. You actually see the thing. Right. Well, thank you very much indeed. It's always a pleasure to talk about my father's work. And so what I thought I'd do is give you a brief introduction to him, tell you a bit about him, and then tell you a little bit about the book and what it says and why it came to be. And then, of course, if you want to ask any questions after that, I'm more than happy to answer them or try to. So there he is on the right. That was taken when he was in his late 50s, I think. He lived to be 92. He was an interesting man because he had no scientific training. He did an economics, well, I'll come to that in a moment. He did an economics degree and was a self-taught naturalist completely. So this talk is about him and about his first book, which is London's Natural History. There it is on the left. That's the original cover of the first edition. The next one. So he did, as I say, his degree was in economics at the LSE, and he was therefore a social scientist. He worked for two organisations before the Second World War called Political and Economic Planning and Mass Observation, which were pioneering organisations, mass observation in particular, run by a man called Tom Harrison, who was a very unusual man. The goal was to try and capture the opinions of ordinary people. In other words, they just sent people out. Good. And asked them to record their views on what was happening at the time. And that was the first time really anybody had gathered just the views of people in that way. And then in the Second World War, he worked for Coastal Command and lived in London the whole time. So that's relevant. Next slide. So he published his first book, London's Natural History, in 1945. That was followed by nearly 30 more books, which depends what you define as a book, nearly 40 if you define some of the larger pamphlets as books. And he was an absolute pioneer of popular natural history publishing. His next book, actually his third book, more accurately, was the one on the top left there, the Collins Pocket Guide to British Birds. And that was revolutionary. It was a full colour picture, a book, which in the 1950s, this was published in 1952, was very unusual. It caused great consternation among all the serious bird watchers because the birds were organized by size and color and not in the scientific order. This, of course, made it far easier for people to identify them, but horrified the bird watching purists who thought it was outrageous that you should present birds out of the scientific order. And he was always willing to be a bit iconoclastic in that way. He had radical views on many things throughout his life. And he went on writing right up to his, until he died. In fact, when his last admission to hospital, when he was admitted to hospital, the nurse who was checking him in was going through the long list of questions they asked and came to the question, occupation. And she said, oh, silly me, retired, of course. And he said very firmly, I am not retired, I am an author. So he regarded himself as an author till the very end, and indeed he was. He had several books on the go at that stage. Right, so that's what he was. The next one, but he was first and foremost a naturalist. But as a result of that, as a result of his deep knowledge of natural history, he became one of the pioneers of conservation as well, particularly in the second half of the 20th century. So before and during the war, he was very active in the London Natural History Society, and indeed after the war. Eventually, he was its president. Perhaps the most significant early thing in his career was his membership. He was the secretary to what was called the Wildlife Conservation Special Committee, often known as the Huxley Committee, which was set up. It was the body that set up the national park system immediately after the war. And they realized that they needed to do more than just national parks. They needed to consider conservation more widely. So this committee made recommendations which set up the what was then called the Nature Conservancy. It's now called Natural England in this country, Scottish Natural Heritage. No, it's changed its name there too. They change their name all the time, these organisations. And he was that brought him into contact with all the great and the good of British conservation. People like Julian Huxley and Arthur Tansley and other great names like that. Then after that, he was involved in a whole host of different organisations, the British Trust for Ecology, the Royal Society of Protection of Birds. He was on their councils and all sorts of things for many years. He was a founder of the Berks, Bucks and Oxen Naturalist Trust, now Wildlife Trust, when he moved to Oxfordshire after the war. And he was heavily involved in a thing called the Society for Promotion of Nature Reserves, which has changed its name many times as well. But it was not only nationally. If the next bit shows you that internationally too, he was heavily involved. So he was a key member of what's now called IUCN, but it was originally called the International Union for the Preservation of Nature, now the Conservation of Nature. And he chaired a key committee called the Survival Service Commission, which was originally called the Species Service Commission. And he was also the on-gen secretary. All this work that he did was unpaid. Because he had an income from writing, he did an enormous amount of unpaid work. So he was a volunteer for all these organizations, and he was the on-secretary, in other words, unpaid, of what was then called the Fauna Preservation Society. It had changed its original name, which was the Society for the Preservation of the Fauna of the Empire. Fortunately, they got rid of that bit by the 1960s. And it then changed its name, in fact, while he was there, to the Fauna and Flora Preservation Society, and is nowadays much more sensibly called Fauna and Flora International. And these are major organizations on the international scene, and he was a big player in all of those. So in addition to being an author and a naturalist, he was also involved in all the major conservation movements of the second half of the 20th century. The next one. So his big thing was natural history. That's what he was. He was a naturalist. He was totally self-taught, and he made records. He was extremely assiduous in making records of things. And one of the things he made records of was the first flowering date of plants. And he kept this up for 50 years. And when he eventually stopped doing this, because he moved house, he and I analyzed his data and produced what at the time, in 2002, was the largest single study on the impacts of climate change on the natural world. And what it showed was that, on average, plants were flowering about a week earlier than they had been at the beginning of the period, 50 years before. So there'd been this huge change. And that was published in Science, which was obviously one of the leading science journals. And a huge amount of global interest in that, as you can see from the bit at the bottom. Some of you may be able to read that. I can't. I can read the bit which says rapid changes in flowering time in British plants, but the rest of it, I'm afraid, is a closed book to me. So his data, which he merely gathered because he was good at gathering data, turned out to be hugely important. And the next one. So that's him. And what I want to talk to you about now, fairly briefly, is the book. So the book was called London's Natural History. It was published as number 3, but it was actually, because he was more organized than the others, it was actually the first to be published in this new series called The New Naturalist, which is still going. It's reached up volume 150 or something these days. I can't remember what it's got to. But the same publishers, Collins, which is now HarperCollins, everything changed its name. They still produce this series, and new volumes come out every year. The editors of this, who were absolutely the establishment of British natural history and ecology at the time, the editors asked him to write a book on the natural history of the Thames Valley. And he said, I don't know enough about the natural history of the Thames Valley, but I will write you a book about the natural history of London. And I think at first they were quite taken aback, because nobody had ever before suggested that a city had a natural history that was worth considering. But But he had lived all his life in London, and he knew it better than anywhere else, and he did know its natural history. And so as a result, he produced what is a completely pioneering study. This is the first study anywhere of a major study of the natural history of a city. So, but unfortunately, it was published in what you might call the popular literature, not the academic literature, and it wasn't really paid much attention to by the academic world, which is quite common, I think. Academics tend to have a slightly myopic view of the world, I can say that. I think it's now being recognized, I think, in the last, say, 20 years as being pioneering and important. But the subject has moved on and the systems have moved on, so it's probably not having the influence it might have had. Next one, please. So here's the contents page of the book. I'm afraid the very bottom bit's got lost, but my apologies for that. Anyway, this is most of the contents. So the book has a number of chapters about the history of London. In other words, what was there before London? How did London grow? And what survives that growth? So there is that sort of background of what London was built on, as it were. Then he talks to some extent, and in detail actually, he talks about the novel habitats, so the urban and suburban habitats, which are novel. I mean, it's only really in the last 200 years that these habitats have existed in any substantial form. So they are new habitats, and organisms have adapted to them in interesting ways. So you have chapters like nature indoors, in other words, what happens inside buildings, the wholly built up areas and the partly built up areas. So he goes through those fairly systematically. And then you have all these influences, all the driving forces, as it were. So digging things up, which I did a lot of, transport things, bringing things in from overseas, moving things around and so on. The influence of water supply, so the fact that there are huge reservoirs all around London, which from a bird watcher's point of view is hugely important. Refuse disposal, so rubbish tips in those days were pretty well open and had an interesting fauna. Smoke, so pollution at the time, the big issue of pollution was smoke, because this is before Clean Air Act. So most houses in London in the 40s and 50s were just heated with coal. Most buildings were just heated with coal. So there were open coal fires everywhere, belching out huge amounts of smoke. And that combined in foggy weather to make something called smog, which was a dense fog full of smoke, and sort of concentrate the smoke, because the fog occurs when there are things like temperature inversions and the air movement, and those kill people in very large numbers. In the early 50s, there were a series of major smog events with huge numbers of deaths. And those were what were instrumental in there being Clean Air Acts later. But at the time he wrote this, smoke was hugely important. Note that nowadays we're much more worried about nitrogen oxides and things like that, because we've more or less sorted the problem of smoke. Well, actually, we perhaps haven't, because the rise of the wood-burning stove means that there are now particulate problems from that in urban areas, which is a bit surprising, but there we are. Then there's food, horticulture, agriculture, and so on and so forth. Sport and leisure, and he calls it sport, but it's much broader than that, actually. Then he has a thing called the cult of nature, which is fascinating. So we're now getting into the bottom of my bullet points here, which is the conflict. So the cult of nature is something that was fairly new, that many people were wanting to engage with nature, and it became, in some sense, a cult. The problem with that was when you have several million people trying to engage with nature in a confined area, their impact on the natural world is absolutely huge. So he talks about that to a great extent. The final chapter, which has disappeared off the bottom of the screen, I'm sorry, is the influence of war. And that was something that could not be ignored in 1945. Large swathes of London were bombed flat. These areas had a unique ecology. if you were writing the book now, unless you were very pessimistic, you probably wouldn't include that chapter. But you might include other things. In fact, there are quite a few other things you might include, because nowadays there are other concerns and other worries, but I don't think you'd include a chapter on war. So that's the basic premise of the book. That's what it contains. So it talks about the history, it talks about the novel habitats, it talks about the impacts of people and why there are all these novel habitats and therefore novel species or novel ecology. And then it talks about these conflicts of various sorts. The next one. So the main messages from the book, I think you could say, are the following. I think the single most important message is that cities can be rich in wildlife. And he always used to say that there was nowhere better in the country to be a bird watcher than in London, because there was an astonishing range of things to be seen in a relatively confined area. So that was a really important message. And most naturalists before then would have thought that if they were going to see wildlife, what they had to do was to go somewhere, preferably quite a long way away if they lived in London. And what he was saying was, no, that's not necessary. You don't need to do that. The wildlife is here. It's not the same wildlife that you'd see if you went to some pristine natural habitat, not that we have any, but if you went to some relatively untouched bit of habitat, you'd see different things. But if you stay in London, you will see things. So you do that because there are novel habitats, there are novel communities, and there are new species coming in. There are species to be seen in London in those days, which were seen nowhere else. Many invasive species start off there, less so nowadays, but London was the biggest port in those days. So things came into London and then spread out from London very often. And then there are the close encounters. In other words, the close encounters of people with wildlife and the impact of that. And then the close encounters with all sorts of damaging things. But I've called it, he doesn't use that phrase, I've called it close encounters simply because what he's talking about is the interaction of people and the natural environment. That's the fundamental message, I suppose, of the book. It's about what happens when people in huge numbers in a confined area have this impact on the natural world. How does the natural world respond? How do the people respond? They're both critical things to consider. Next one, please. So we can look at the surviving natural habitats. There are things that still to this day survive in London. Principally, they are woodland. So that you get, on the urban fringes, you get places like Epping Forest and Oxley Woods. I'm not sure whether, actually, I have to confess, I don't know whether Oxley Woods still survive. I imagine they do. I'm not being a Londoner, I'm afraid I'm a bit unclear. But I know that Epping Forest does. But these are usually heavily managed. You don't get sort of wild woodland, as it were. They're different in many ways from the woodlands you would see if you went a long way from London. But nevertheless, there are trees there. There is ground flora. Well, there is ground flora sometimes, not always. I mean, one of the things he talks about in the book is Highgate Wood. He lived in Highgate during the war, so Highgate Wood, I guess, is where he strolled off for the evening, as it were, if there wasn't an air raid on. And so Highgate Wood has absolutely no ground flora at all. It didn't in those days. And that's simply because of human pressure. And there's a picture in the book showing, because there was an area of Highgate Wood that was fenced off and was a bird reserve, so to allow some birds to breed, I suppose. And it shows how the vegetation is so much more dense. I mean, there is vegetation behind the fence when there's almost nothing the other side. So this emphasizes the impact of huge numbers of people in confined spaces. There's no point pretending they're not going to have a dramatic impact on the environment. So the main sort of semi-natural habitats are probably woodlands. There are grasslands, a lot of grassland, but that doesn't resemble any other form of natural grassland because it's nearly always very heavily modified. It's either urban, sort of park grassland, or it's golf courses or things like that. You get occasional strips of sort of rough ground by roads and things like that, but these are minor. So the grasslands survive, but they're heavily modified. But most of the other habitats, particularly those that are unproductive or wet, have gone. So there were originally, in fact, there still was in 1945, a small bog on Hampstead Heath. And of course, Hampstead Heath was a heath, hence the name. But all that has gone. It's all been transformed. And the fens and the equivalent wet woodlands that go with fens, they've all gone. The fens have all been drained. All the wet areas have been drained because people don't like wet things for some reason. They have a horror of seeing water standing anywhere, and they think they must be got rid of immediately, which is a very bad thing to do. Anyway, so there are natural habitats in London. He makes this point very strongly. Next one. But then perhaps the most interesting thing, though, is the habitats that are altered, well, the next two really, the habitats that have been altered by human activity. So these are sort of recognizable habitats. You would find something similar elsewhere outside a city, but so heavily altered by human activity with varying degrees that their ecology is totally different. And so you get extensive areas of grassland in parks, but because it's mown continuously, because people in parks want to walk on basically a lawn, which is biologically about as dull as you can get, it actually loses all biological interest. And the trees are nearly always planted trees, so they're non-native species. And that actually means that they have a much smaller set of other associated organisms. So you tend not to get many of the insects and so on, which feed on the native trees, often don't on the introduced species. Nevertheless, there are things there, and they offer new niches for species to adapt to and colonize. There's a photograph there of Berkeley Square and the plane trees there, and it shows how bare underneath. All these photos, by the way, are from the book. Shows how bare it is underneath the trees. And then, there are lots of ponds. That pond is being used for an amenity purpose, obviously. There is actually behind it, and you won't see it any longer, I don't think, an area of almost natural habitat, basically a bit of reed swamp or sedge fen at the back of the pond. I would be very surprised if that's still there. Mostly those sorts of wet habitats have long gone. And then finally, in the next slide, you get to the extreme novel habitats, which there aren't parallels for really anywhere much. I mean, these have quite distinct fauna and flora, totally different ecology, but they are probably the most abundant habitats in the city. And therefore, they're hugely important. And one of the novel things about the book was paying attention to them, actually worrying about what was on them and what they were able to support in the way of wildlife. So you get, for example, that top left picture, it says a typical in London street with no gardens. It's also got an air raid shelter in the middle of the road, which is probably unusual these days. But you might say there's no room for wildlife here at all. But of course, then you see there are all those pigeons. And so there clearly is wildlife there. It's just not wildlife as we might recognize it, as it were. And the bottom left photograph shows waste ground around a gasworks. Gasworks being things which are now extinct, of course, because in those days all gas was made from coal it was town gas. So they had to make it and then store it. It wasn't just pumped continuously. And you can see here that this is basically waste ground, which has been colonized by a range of plants. And this is a unique set of plants which move into these habitats, which are not found together elsewhere in nature. And then there are all sorts of, even in most extreme built-up areas, so inside buildings, you have wildlife. So there's a rat in a warehouse, showing that there is wildlife there. It may not be the wildlife we all love to see and cuddle, but some people do, but maybe some people don't. Nevertheless, it's there, and therefore there is an ecology to be considered on that. And the adaptability of species, house mice, which are called house mice because they have adapted over the years very strongly to associate with human settlement. There they are nesting in a greenhouse in somebody's flower pots. And you get, birds in the same situation. He talks about gardens extensively, which are not novel. They are sort of novel habitats, but they're a bit more like human-affected ones. And he talks about the special association of species, which I think it comes in the next slide, I think. Next one. Yeah. Oh, no, we could do the causes. Okay, so one of the things he talks about at length is the causes of change. Now, in some ways, this is pretty blindingly obvious. I mean, here's the view. So this is captioned view of London from a tall building near St Paul's, I think. I can't actually see that bit because of the control bar in my on my screen. Apologies. And basically, what you're seeing is buildings as far as the eye can see. You can see, there are a few trees up to the right near what I guess is near the Houses of Parliament somewhere. My London geography is not the House of Parliament way over to the left. I know what that is on the right. Anyway, so he talks about the various things. He talks about buildings. He talks about excavation. That's digging materials up. He talks about demolition, but mainly in the context of a war and how that there were all these bomb sites with their unique fauna and flora. He talks about the role that transport plays in bringing things in spreading things around, and so on and so forth. He talks about leisure, mainly under the heading of sport, but it goes broader because he talks about the interaction of people wanting just to go out and be in nature. He talks about pollution, which in those days, as I said, was mainly smoke. Now would be different things. But what he doesn't talk about, unsurprisingly, because nobody was talking about it then, but if you wrote the book now, you would definitely talk about, is the impact of climate change, which is particularly severe in cities and will be particularly severe in a city like London, large areas of which are below sea level. So cooling cities is a really difficult problem because the buildings generate and trap heat, and the surfaces are not cooling surfaces. So there's nothing about that in the book, but there would be if you were to write it now. It would be a major issue to consider. And the next one is the new species. So the other big message is that there are new species coming in all the time and new associations of species. So this is the distinct ecology, things that people haven't seen before. So he talks about the garden bird association. These are mainly woodland birds like robins and song thrushes and blackbirds and things like that, and blue tits, which you still find if you go into a natural woodland, semi-natural woodland in the countryside somewhere, you'll see these birds. You'll see them a lot easier if you go to your garden or somebody's garden, because they're more willing to expose themselves in that situation. But there is this distinct association of birds, which is the garden bird association, as he called it. He also talks about new species arriving. So one of the striking things was this thing called the black redstart, and the lower photograph is a black redstart. That's a male black redstart, and they started breeding in the bomb sites. This is a Mediterranean species. If you've been to the Mediterranean in summer, you'll have seen or heard these birds. You may not have noticed them, but you will have seen or heard them. They're really, really quite common in the Mediterranean. They live in cliffs and rocky areas and so on. And they turned up in London in the Second World War because suddenly a new habitat was provided for them, which was all the bomb sites. So nobody there. So they were fairly secluded in that sense. And lots of holes in walls and so on and so forth, which enabled them to find breeding places and so on and so forth. And presumably, because in these bomb sites there was a unique flora as well, and the top photograph shows that, there was probably also a pretty rich insect fauna which the birds were feeding on. So he talks about the ability of species to take advantage of these novel habitats. And that photograph above shows two invasive species colonizing a bomb site. In the foreground is Canadian fleabane, which, as its name implies, is not a native British plant, but it's it's found widely still in this country. But it became very common in the Second World War on these bomb sites. Even more interesting is the one behind, which is roseberry willow herb, which is a very common native plant found all over Britain now. But actually, before this, and particularly in the 19th century, this was a very rare plant. It was found in a few Scottish mountains. And something happened to it in the early part of the 20th century, probably an evolutionary event, we don't know what. And it started spreading and becoming quite a weed. And then in the Second World War, it found all these wonderful places on bomb sites, which just slid it down to the ground. And it became extremely common there. And it remains common to this day. And the other point he makes is that, and this is still true, there are new species arriving continually. This is a dynamic process. If you create new habitats, and particularly if you have a lot of movement of things, including species, but also transport and so on, you'll get new species coming in all the time. Some of these will be completely innocuous. Many of them won't establish. Some of them will really well establish very well. And of those that establish well, some actually will turn out to be major pests, like, for example, Japanese knotweed or Himalayan balsam these days. So I think those are the key messages that this book puts across. The next slide. It's worth talking, I think, a bit about why he wrote it. Well, really, I think it's because it's what he knew about. He'd lived in London all his life. During the war, obviously, travel was very limited. He actually unusually was traveling because he worked for Coastal Command, and his job was to go around all the airfields and try to advise on how to minimize bird strikes on aircraft. So he did get around, actually, but he spent a lot of time in London, even so. And he was very proud of the fact that London provided a naturalist with a lot of it. And so when he was asked to write on the Thames Valley, he said, no, I'll write on London's naturalist. So I think that's what it was. He was there in the war, and he believed he had a real message to give. One of the things that I have never noticed this before when I read the book originally, and I've looked at it before, but this time I was studying the photographs with more care and attention than I did before when I was preparing this talk. Virtually all the photographs are acknowledged, all the colour ones are acknowledged. They're mainly very well-known photographers of the time, people like John Markham and Eric Hosking. Eric Hosking was the leading wildlife photographer of the time. Most of the black and white ones, too, also have acknowledgements to various photographers, but there's one or two which don't. And that must mean they were his own photos. So I think this is a photo which is not acknowledged. I think it must be a photo he took. And when I looked at it, I suddenly realized that's almost certainly my mother, because they were together in London during the war. And I'm pretty sure that's her feeding the birds on the gulls on Victoria Embankment. So that's rather struck me as an extraordinary thing that I have never noticed before about the book. So fine. So that's basically what the book is about. That's what he was about. I'm going to finish up with a quotation, if I can have the next one. This is a quotation from Charles Darwin's autobiography. And my father was a very modest man. If he thought I was comparing him to Darwin, he would be absolutely horrified. Nevertheless, it actually fits him brilliantly. So this is Darwin talking about himself without false modesty. This is a genuine piece of a modest man. Darwin was a modest man. He says, this comes after several paragraphs saying what a useless person he is. And he says, on the favourable side of the balance, I think that I am superior to a common run of men in noticing things which easily escape attention and in observing them carefully. My industry has been nearly as great as it could have been in the observation and collection of facts. What is far more important, my love of natural science has been steady and ardent. Well, if you replace the word science with history, my love of natural history, that would be a very accurate description of my father, who was indeed a great observer and a great cataloguer of the observations that he made. So thank you. That's him. That's the book. I'm happy to answer any questions, take part in any discussions that you have.
Well, thank you, Alastair. Such a beautiful talk. Yeah, no, so I say this is a seminar, not the lecture. So I'd like to open up really sort of discussions. So Also, yeah, ask my students to speak up as well, but I don't know. I think, I don't know, maybe Irenee or Tom, you want to kickstart somehow?
Sure. So, I mean, the first thing I'd say, Takesh, was just a little correction there. So I came across the book. In fact, Irenee didn't tell me about it. It was in an article that Irenee wrote about the Greenbelt in AA Files about 10 years ago. I can't hear you. Anyway, you can correct that.
You are muted.
I cannot unmute. Thank you. Yeah, that's right. It was actually exactly contemporary with never modern.
Exactly. So, and so Irenee, so in that essay, somehow London's natural history sort of is a sort of kind of red thread, in a sense, through a much more contemporary, well, both historical and contemporary look at the kind of the Greenbelt in London. But and Irenee has introduced me to a few like key texts. This one, Levi-Strauss's The Science of the Concrete and things like that, and which have become really subjects of total fascination. And actually, Alastair, I'm so pleased to hear your presentation, because you've actually answered quite a few of my questions that had been burning for a long time. I always wondered whether he was a Londoner, and you've answered that well and truly, because many of the great books about London are not by Londoners, about outsiders. And one of the things, I mean, I think we can talk more about the natural history, particularly in relation to contemporary issues, in a bit, but I feel like when I did eventually get the book and kind of read it, it's one of the great books about London, regardless of natural history. But you know, that I'd say that one, Ian Nairn's Guide to London from the 60s, Rasmussen, I think also from the 40s, and Sam Selvon's Lonely Londoners, which is kind of from an immigrant's point of view, kind of Westbourne Grove, Paddington, outsiders view, are these kind of, you know, it's so difficult to understand London, and there are a few books that give you a way in, and I think that the Fitter one is like quite an extraordinary one, and it brings you through a whole series of spaces and observations that are kind of, you know, are often not the primary sources of, or the first things one notices. So that's the you've already answered that question. The other thing that I thought is contemporary relevance of it. I'm working at the moment in Zurich with an ecologist called Tom Crowther, a very interesting young ecologist, sometimes quite controversial, who'd written an article about the overheating cities, the heat island effect, and so on. And anyway, we're working with him, and then we had a beer after work, and I said, "Have you heard of Fitter?" And then he said, "Well, of course I've heard of Fitter." And we had an exchange about it, particularly about below ground ecologies and things like that. And I thought, was Fitter onto that already in the 40s? He went, "No, he's a contemporary ecologist." And it's about you.
So, yeah. I don't think I'm any longer a contemporary ecologist.
Anyway, there was this kind of lineage, and of course, then he said, "Oh yes, no, that book, that's the foundation of data. It still is the first systematic data about ecology in London." And I think it's still used in places like Kew and places like that, still have it as its sort of ground zero. But the bit that you touched on at the end, which for me is also super interesting, is how visual he was. Because you've mentioned Hoskin and Markham, who were amazing nature photographers at the time. And then there are many others who are much less well known, and then now we've just discovered, and that's fantastic, because that picture with the birds, with the seagulls, is one of the absolute classics in the book. It's amazing to hear that that it was actually by your father.
Well, I'm making assumptions there. I don't know that for sure, but the fact that it's not acknowledged must, I think, mean that.
I think it's a very nice. I mean, it's a very nice way to look at it. I hope it's true. The thing that I think is amazing about it is that the visual essay, the kind of that runs through it, is at times quite extraordinary in the story it tells. There are some times where it's actually very kind of both kind of funny and tender. There's one image of cabbages being eaten by caterpillars, and then you turn over the page and it's butterflies. It's an incredible thing to put together, that sort of like, how do you arrange the butterflies and the caterpillars? Well, you know, one follows the other. So there is an amazing picture of a man in a bowler hat and pinstripe suit feeding pelicans in St. James's Park.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is that the man in the bowler hat is extinct, but the pelicans are still there. So the natural history, which includes the human species as one of its sort of equivalent subjects, somehow now when you read it, whatever it is, 70 years on, 75 years on, it actually has a whole set of other resonances which are to do with what things survive and what things don't. And some of them are not just natural habitat, they're actually, I mean, the air raid shelter, the man in the bowler hat, and many others. You suddenly realize that the agriculture in Green Park, there's haymaking in Green Park, which is an extraordinary image to think that after the war, there was still agriculture going on in the city.
And there were sheep grazing in front of Ken House as well, Kenwood House, yeah. Mm.
So I would just, maybe my only question did he have a particularly visual, do you remember him sort of somehow describing things in visual terms as well as in the kind of the kind of beautiful writing, which is obviously the heart of the book?
Well, I think what I would say, he was an observer. That's why I finished up with that point. He was always looking at things and endlessly making notes of things. My memories as a child were that, you know, if you went anywhere, he was always writing in a little notebook about things that he'd seen, and then he would disappear into his study in the evenings, and he would systematically store the observations he'd made into a complex filing system, which I still have all the filing cards. I'm not quite sure what to do with them, but anyway, I can't get rid of them. So he was an observer, I think, rather than anything. I think you also have to bear in mind that the photographic editor of the whole series at that time was Eric Hosking himself. So I think it would probably be fair and right to credit him with a considerable amount of the choice of illustrations and so on. I'm sure my father had a role to play in that, but I'm also sure that Eric Hosking, who was not someone to stand back, as it were, I'm sure he would have had a large role, large say in what pictures were put in and so on. So I think you have to see it as some sort of collaborative thing there.
Do you know, my last question is there an archive somewhere of both of kind of manuscripts, research, images that forms, you know, the background to the published book?
Well, the sad thing is that before he died, I've got some of the material myself here, but only a limited amount, and I'm not quite sure what to do with it at the moment. I know what I should be doing with it is I should be setting up a website and making all this thing, digitizing it all and making it available. But the real problem is that before he died, he gave huge amounts of stuff to the Bodleian in Oxford. He lived near Oxford at the time, and it made sense. And they were very happy to take it. And after he died, I thought, well, the obvious thing with all the rest of the material is to, you know, give it to the Bodleian as well. So I contacted the Bodleian, and they obviously knew nothing about it. And I eventually discovered that it was all still sitting in a warehouse in Newnham Courtney, and nobody had looked at it in 10 years. And I thought, well, until they are going to catalogue it and do something with it, there's absolutely no point in my adding to the warehouse in Newnham Courtney. So I probably should get back to them and say, have you actually looked at it yet? My expectation is that they haven't. I think they take in too much, and then they presumably prioritise which things they're going to look at. So the answer is most of his material is there, and I would imagine a lot of the stuff for London's natural history will be there. I have some material, but rather limited amount.
Great, thank you.
Alastair, what I would like to maybe direct questions for just a brief while to the kind of ecology which your father was doing with this book, which is very different from the perception which we have today about ecology, because I assume that the majority of people think of, and for perhaps good reasons, of ecology as a science which is essentially geared towards conservation, and where humans are to a great extent a destructive force. And of course, for architects, it's terrible news. And so architects and ecologists are a priori sworn enemies. Yeah. The one distracting what the ecologist loves.
Well, I'm glad I'm on a remote location in that case.
And what is I think absolutely marvelous about the book, London's Natural History, is that it offers a means to reconciliation. That there is a very, very strong, reading it from this perspective, there is a very, very strong message of optimism that animal and plant societies can actually cohabit with human societies, and not only that, cohabit successfully. I mean, not only successfully, but partly successfully.
Well, in a novel and distinct way, I think is the point, yeah.
That's right. We could even say in a creative way. And this is, so unusual, and at the end, that's what struck me very, very deeply reading this book, that suddenly, 50% of my guilt disappeared, and that we could imagine a different kind of urbanism from the one that had been current, which became more like a cooperation between us as architects and planners on the one hand, and specialists of the natural world like yourself. And I wonder what you think yourself as an Takeshi, you should have said as an equally prominent ecologist as your father was. And what do you think about this relationship between ecologist and architect and what to do? And perhaps at the center of this question, there is one about the future of cities and how one might think about cities, but also how one might make them. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really powerful question. I mean, I'd say first of all that he would never have called himself an ecologist. He would have definitely said he was a naturalist. What he was interested in was the organisms, and their distribution and where they were and how many there were. So now there is a branch of ecology which does that. I mean, there is a branch of ecology which is basically scientific natural history. I also think I'm not totally convinced that in ecology, the focus is on conservation. I think actually it's not. There's only a small fraction of the ecological community which is actually particularly interested in conservation as such. I mean, many of those who are practicing ecologists are more interested in the animal behavior or something like that, or I mean, I suppose you can call an interest in carbon cycling conservation in some sense, but it isn't really in the sense of, I mean, if you talk about conservation, you're normally talking about maximizing the biodiversity of areas and that sort of thing, trying to maintain and restore that. So a large swathe of ecology has nothing to do with that. And in fact, I would say that natural history has more in common as a subject with conservation than most of ecology does. And one of the sad things is that natural history stopped being a respectable subject. So now, you know, within the academic world, people don't describe themselves as naturalists. Darwin would have. Darwin explicitly called himself a naturalist. And my father was a naturalist, but I would think you would struggle to find anybody in a modern ecology department who would describe themselves first and foremost as a naturalist. And that's, I think, really sad, because it means that that connection between understanding the natural world and the discipline, the science underlying it, has perhaps been lost. But to get to your core question, which is about how you reconcile that science with architecture and what you do about it in cities, I think it's absolutely fascinating. So I'm involved. I'm a trustee of the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, and they're developing a program which they call Wilder Yorkshire. And the whole point of this is to try to increase the amount of wildlife in Yorkshire as a whole. So not just preserving 5% of the land as nature reserves and hoping that those things survive there, but asking how can you ensure that the landscape is rich in wildlife in the broadest sense. And that's very difficult, but it's challenging. But it brings instantly a major problem, which is that 90% of the people of Yorkshire live on 10% of the land in the cities. And they probably don't want it to be wilder. They would probably want it to be more nature rich, but not, I think, wilder. I mean, if you said to the average person living in Bradford, do you want Bradford to be wilder? They'd say, no, I'm sure, we don't, thank you very much, because it would conjure up all sorts of images of what the city might be like, which I think would be uncomfortable. So I think that we have a problem within the conservation world that there is still, I mean, it originated with the protection of the countryside, conservation, and it has never come to grips with what that means for cities. And I think it still is the case. I mean, there is a London Wildlife Trust who do wonderful stuff. And the organisation you're partnering with at the moment, again, they're doing this. But this is a minority thing. The vast bulk of the conservation movement worries about wildness and natural, as they call them, areas. They're not really natural at all, of course. There's no such thing as a natural area in this country at all. Probably anywhere in the world, actually, maybe a bit of Antarctica. So it's a real issue within the conservation movement, and they are going to have to come to terms with it and get to grips with it. How do you engage with the 90% of the population who are urban, who may not be terribly interested in your vision of this wild Britain full of, I don't know, wolves or whatever it may be? And actually that may put them off horribly. They may say, the last thing I want to do is to go out in the countryside and see a wolf, thank you very much. If I go out, I want it to be looking like the National Trust. You know, so I think there is a disconnect, and a serious one and a problematic one. And I guess that what you're trying to do, which is to make architecture and the natural world compatible, and more than compatible, actually cooperate and collaborate, is really important in that. But I think you need probably to find more broad thinking people in the conservation movement to come and join you. And because the things they do are perfectly applicable in many cases to what happens in cities. It's just that they don't do them generally in cities. Does that sort of answer the question?
It did that, and it is also fascinating. Thank you. Peter, you might have a question. Peter is a very old friend and distinguished architect and a lover of the natural world.
Yes, yes.
And he's growing a woodlands somewhere in Wales.
I wanted to tell Alastair that the bog he mentioned in Hampstead Heath is definitely still there. I've been to
it is. Oh, good. Phew.
It was mentioned in a great novel by Will Self. It's called Book of Dave, which was about the flooding of London when only that tip of the top of Hampstead Heath remained, and it's the source of the of the river that goes down through Hampstead Heath, which is dammed to make those ponds. Very special piece of landscape in London. I don't really have any questions at the moment. I think it's just very interesting.
One question that occurred to me, Alastair, is that your father's book on London's natural history was published in exactly the same year as Abercrombie's famous plan for London was actually published. And Abercrombie was very sensitive, I think, to the presence of nature in London, and in the famous plan of London, in the drawings, the presence of nature is actually spelled out on the drawing, both as it exists and as it ought to be. And I was wondering whether your father could have been at all aware that this major piece of work was being done by a planner. And because it seems so obvious in hindsight that the two of them should have been working together.
Yeah. I don't think Abercrombie's mentioned in the book.
No, he's not, as far as I know.
And I've never heard him talk about that. So the answer is I simply don't know. He must have been, I mean, after the book was published, he clearly would have been aware of it. I don't think, it's one of those things I wish I could ask him. But I simply don't know the answer to the question.
Can I sort of open up the question to our room here?
Yeah.
But maybe start with me. We've been doing this sort of a nature sort of conservation or the nature reserve projects in Kingston with the students for the last couple of years. Every time we do this, we get to this conundrum that, the best thing is not to build anything. So then kind of almost sort of lose the purpose of us, being here to somehow contribute to the local society or the community or the wildlife exist. So it's just but I think this book somehow has a kind of key to it that Irenee mentioned that the optimism is perhaps the word that I think is very important in this, that whatever you do influences natural world in some way, and then the wildlife still exists and adapt and thrive in some form or another. So I guess, I don't know, it's not really a question as such, but yeah, I'm just sort of looking for something that, quite kind of I don't know, something positive, something kind of a brighter future through the process. And so students or tutors, anybody wants to join this conversation? Francesca?
I could definitely ask questions. I was quite interested in what you were just talking about with conservation and the broader conversation. We're going on a study trip to Wild Ken Hill in Norfolk, and they divide up their land into 3 parts. One is rewilding, one is conservation, and one is regenerative agriculture, which kind of separates conservation from rewilding and from agriculture. And I didn't know, do you think it's good to separate them, following on from what you were saying, and think of conservation under its own bracket? And then also going back to what Tom was saying about Green Park and making hay, like, is that maybe an angle that we could think about bringing back in to living alongside happily with different ecologies, different natures?
Okay, that's fascinating. Do I think that I mean, I think inevitably rewilding of something. I'll come back to the rewilding in a moment. And regenerative agriculture are different things. I mean, you can't do both together on the same patch of land because as soon as you do agriculture, you're not rewilding. So I think you have no option but to do them separately. But I think these are three things, and they also have a conservation area as well. So they're presumably trying to, in some sense, preserve something as well. That I do find puzzling. But I don't see why you would separate that out.
They flooded part of the land, and it's become more like a bog. So it's bringing water back in, which is the bit that we normally try and push out, as you were saying.
But if they're not rewilding that, does that mean they're managing it in some way, to prevent trees or something?
That's also a very good question, and I think we'll find out more when we're there.
Because I mean, one of the challenges in conservation is a lot of conservation work requires quite intensive management. So if you're interested in chalk grassland or something like that, you have got to graze it. It is an artificial habitat that was created over millennia by human activity, and it's incredibly rich in plants and insects, and people want it to persist, but you can't. It's not compatible with the concept, let us say, of rewilding, because if you rewild those hills, you'll lose your chalk grassland. You'll get wood. I mean, naturally there would be woodland. Now there's a huge. I mean, there's an enormous area of debate here because naturally this country is woodland, all of it. Left to itself, anything here, there are very few exceptions to that, bits of salt marsh and so on, but anything else goes to woodland. In some situations, it can go beyond woodland and end up in bog. And the ground becomes so wet because of the growth of bog mosses that the trees die. But generally speaking, it's woodland. So then the question is, how did all these plants which don't grow in woodland survive in the time when there was no agriculture going on? And there's a guy called Frans Vera in Holland who some years ago, quite a few years ago now, put forward this idea that big herbivores kept the landscape semi-open. So that even though the natural vegetation is woodland, these big herbivores, aurochs and bison and other things, were wandering around, knocking trees over and eating them up and so on and so forth. And the consequence was a mosaic of open. Of course, nobody can possibly tell whether this is true or not. But if it is true, then rewilding becomes a complete non sequitur because you can't go back to that because we don't have aurochs. And we don't have bison in this. We could reintroduce bison. The Kent Wildlife Trust is reintroducing bison on one of its reserves. No, water buffalo, I think, but it may be bison, one or the other. Anyway, and they may have that effect. But this is the problem with the concept of rewilding, because it implies you're going back to some primeval and pristine state, which we can't do. The climate has changed. There is nitrogen pouring out of the atmosphere all the time, so that everything is more fertile, the ground is more fertile. All those big herbivores have gone, all the big carnivores have gone. So if you say, I'm going to rewild a patch of land and put a fence around it or whatever, you will get a novel habitat. It's different from anything that ever existed before. It's a woodland without big animals, and that's never existed anywhere, possibly in New Zealand before human colonization, but that's about it. Because, we always had big animals here. There were bison, there were wolves, there were bears, all in fact go back far enough, there were lions, we've always had big creatures in the country. We just got rid of them. And now we have this bizarre concept, which we call rewild. It isn't. The correct term, I'm sure, is wilding. You want to make it wilder. Fine. You stop managing it. And if you stop managing it, nature will do all sorts of curious things which you can't possibly predict. But it isn't rewilding, because it's not going back to anything that anybody would ever recognize if they were hanging around from 1,000 years ago or whatever. So that's one important question. Then there's the issue of, so you can wild places. You can also manage places intensively. My example of chalk grassland, you must graze it. So that's a sort of agriculture. It's a very non-intensive agriculture. And then there's the question of what do you do about agriculture? Do you go for, this is a big debate, do you allow some parts of the landscape to be as intensively farmed as possible to maximize the yield of crops from them, so that you then don't need to do that over such large areas, and you can actually have quite big areas of land which you manage in a much less intensive way? Or do you try and have a semi-intensive or non-intensive, who knows, agricultural system more or less everywhere? And that's not been resolved. I think it's not straightforward is the answer to that, because there are clear pros and cons for both. So the question you raise is an absolutely fascinating one, and is worth several PhDs.
I'm so disappointed you couldn't answer. Thank you.
Great. We have a comment from Michael Badu on the chat, which I think if maybe Michael wants to kind of bring up, I think it's very relevant.
Michael, are you here?
It's a very long it's the beginning of a PhD.
Yeah, no, Michael Badu is one of our lecturers at Kingston. I'm not sure he's around. Peter, you raised a hand, or was it mistaken?
No, I did want to ask another question. It's about what Alastair was just talking about, this question of wilding or management. And I was just interested to talk about that in relation to the ecology in the centre of cities. Because I was struck by those photographs. I've always been struck by them, by how bare a lot of the landscapes that were shown there and the parkland was in comparison with how it is now. And one could say that a lot of the parks today, I'm sure there's been a reduction in total area of parkland, but generally they're lusher. There's more planting. The air is cleaner. And because the city is much richer, people's gardens are fuller, more cared for, and there are a lot more street trees now than there were then. So I'm interested to know whether you think, on balance, the range of ecologies that you might find in London now are more or less than you would find in London in the 50s.
I think they're different. So several of the interesting habitats that are talked about in the book, for example, sewage farms, are now extinct. We don't manage sewage in that way any longer. So there's no such thing as a sewage farm. And those, as you point out, those incredibly barren streets are rare now. They still exist, but less so in London than in other cities, actually. And there's been, as you say, a huge amount of tree planting and things like that. So it is a greener city, I think, than it was. I think it's worth bearing in mind that the photographs are all taken in a period of wartime, when things were very different. I think if you'd taken the same set of photographs 10 years before, they might have looked quite different. So there's a bias there, I think, in the selection of photographs. The answer is, of course, I haven't a clue. I genuinely don't know the answer to the question, whether the range of habitats is greater or less. And I'm not sure the data really exist to answer it. They may do, I don't know. Maybe somebody could burrow into, old documents and find out, maybe old maps would tell you what exactly there was in London 60, 70 years ago and what there is now. I don't know. But I think the point I would make is not that it's greater or less, but that it's different. And it will still be different again in another 50 years and another 50 years after that. That cities are dynamic places. I mean, the countryside is dynamic too, but cities even more so because of the intense human activity that takes place there. Always change. I mean, largely thanks to architects, always changing things. So that there's no stability in it at all.
I have been very recently reading this book, which I'm sure you know,
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And this book makes, which I think is a marvelous book in many ways, and so, but it makes a point which I think I find very hard to avoid, which is that humans are major agents in the destruction of species, and that in order to reconstitute or rehabilitate those species would take millions of years.
Well, you couldn't actually. You'd get a different set of species.
But that nevertheless seems to me like a very powerful argument for conservation.
Yes, I agree.
And which is about maintaining the diversity of nature. And this maybe ties into absolutely lovely description by your father, where he talks about the relationship between humans and animals in London. And one example which he gives is what happens when a robin comes and pick worms when somebody is shoveling the earth. And he says that the relationship between animals and humans in London is based on the mixture of trust and mistrust. And I thought that was a wonderful observation, which I think illustrates beautifully this kind of very difficult relationship between the animal world on the one hand and the world of humans. And I think there is a risk that one might read the book of your father as a book which is, so optimistic that animals and humans are going to become great friends. And I think somehow the reality is probably a lot more complicated than this. And
well, I think what happens is that some animals are really, really good, and some plants are really, really good at taking advantage of us. So they are able to use the habitats we create and live in them and flourish in them, and others are not. Most animals are not. And because we are so much the dominant species on the planet now, there are vast swathes of the world where the animals which cannot adapt to the environments we create are basically disappearing and have disappeared. We currently consume over half the primary production on Earth. So we are a dominant animal in a way that no other animal has been in the history of the world. Nothing else has ever occupied even remotely the same sort of dominant position as we do. So we have this enormous impact on the world, and it selects a small number of species which, for whatever reason, are good at living with us. I mean, the one that's the cleverest creature of all, of course, is the chicken, which, by being willing to be eaten in vast numbers, is now the commonest bird by miles. So in purely evolutionary terms, they've done incredibly well. Similarly, wheat and barley are incredibly successful plants. And actually, from the point of view of the evolution of that group, being eaten is fine. No problem about being eaten. That's what happens to everybody sooner or later.
Is that personal advice you're giving us as well?
Well, yeah. I'm not sure I'd take the advice myself, but.
And I don't know whether I may ask you yet another question, and this one is maybe destined in part to the younger architects in the meeting. As an ecologist yourself, and who has thought through your father, and I'm sure also under your own steam about the natural world and humans and the urban context. What would you say an architect should know or should be advised to know about the natural world in order to create successful environments, cities or otherwise? Because I'm saying this very pointedly, because at the moment in schools of architecture, there is exactly zero teaching concerning the natural world.
And do you mean to make cities successful for people or successful for wildlife, or somehow to maximize both those?
For everyone, meaning by for every creature.
Okay. So I think you can only do that by having, I think the first thing you have to worry about is the transport system, which seems to me to be fundamental to getting cities right, which is why most American cities are so horrible, because they are dominated by a distinct form of transport, which creates inimical conditions to most natural habitats, natural communities. So I think transport network is hugely important. I think we have to get away from an obsession with tidiness. We have to not think that a golf course is the most beautiful thing on earth. And there is a tendency to do that. You know, if people see something which is more than 3 inches high, they want to mow it down immediately. And that, you know, waste ground, we call it waste ground. And actually, it's not waste ground at all. It's a widely used term. I use it myself. But actually, that waste ground is one of the places where wildlife thrives. So you can have forgotten corners. You know, it's the not trying to use every last square inch of the city for known purposes, as it were. There should be laziness in that. There should be looseness. There should be failures in that, as it were. It seems to me. What I don't think is the way forward, personally, is the sort of endless vertical forest type approach, because I think there are technological solutions which don't in the end achieve, and they look dramatic, and you know, when you first see them you think, oh wow, that's amazing, but then you think about how on earth is the water being provided for this system, and what are the energy costs of that, and so on and so forth. And that worries me. It seems to me that architects can do better in designing their buildings than relying on a vertical forest to keep it cool. But I mean, I'm sure there's a place for that sort of thing, but it's not the solution anyway. I'm not an architect, so I don't know the answer, but I do think that the way we have historically designed cities, and certainly some of the cities that I know, I mean, Leeds, for example, is recovering now from a period of absolute brutalism where it was destroyed, and Birmingham was another case. And both of these are both cities that were destroyed by the obeisance to the private car. And that's probably the single most important thing, I think.
Tom was in disagreement with something.
Yes, I want to disagree with Irenee.
Sorry, I can't hear.
I wanted to disagree with Irenee.
For the first time.
For the first. Partly because actually, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I suppose that Takesh and Kingston are involved in this too, but I think that now in schools of architecture, people are being taught more about the natural world in different forms in terms of courses in ecology and so on. And one of the ones, I mean, this is why I mentioned him at the beginning, one of the ones who's doing quite a lot of teaching in our department at ETH is Tom Crowther. And one of the first things that he talked about in the opening lecture in the series on ecology was that it was important for us as architects to understand that anything we aspire to or observe above ground, the key to it will be what's going on below ground. and that is the point of coincidence between architecture and sort of different types of ecologies. You know, how you meet the ground, how you go into the ground, how you seal the ground, how you don't seal the ground, and essentially the ground is basically the way that he described it was that the ground is not a substance, it's a space that's as complex as every other space that we might consider above ground. And I think that that's been, and then it kind of goes into lots of different conditions, urban, non-urban, and so on, restoration, as well as, you know, from intensive agriculture to wilding and so on. But the thing that was really interesting is to put this idea of the ground into the conversation as something extremely kind of complex, alive, materially, and somehow I think that mindset does change things, and I think it's a sort of it's a theme that I think in the curriculum is only just beginning, but I suspect that over the next few years will become quite sort of fundamental, in a way in which, you know, I think that it was very different to when I was taught, where essentially, you know, beyond the foundations was not our business anymore. I don't know if that's something that resonates with the kind of, with Alastair, but it feels like it's very present at the moment, and there's a lot of appetite for it.
Well, it's music to my ears, having spent my life worrying about what happened in soil. I give a number of popular lectures about soil. One of them is called "Out of Sight, Out of Mind," and that's the problem. Everybody, you know, we quite literally treat it like dirt, and that's how people think of it. They think of it as just muck. You know, it's a nuisance. It gets muddy, it gets in the way, and so on and so forth. The best thing to do is cover it with concrete. I couldn't agree more. And I think what happens below ground is fundamentally important. You certainly can't understand any ecological system without understanding what's happening below ground.
Come closer.
It's a nice seat.
Yeah.
Hi, it's just more of a broad question. I just wanted to know your thoughts on Ebenezer Howard's garden cities, and, like, you know, is it an example of maybe potential development in the future? Because a lot of people thought it was a success, but the government didn't run with it. I don't know what your thoughts are on that. Just. Yeah.
So let me be clear what the question was. Ebenezer Howard.
The garden city movement.
Is that the name of the architect?
Yeah, electric garden.
I'm way outside my expertise here, but is the question about whether garden cities are a good idea?
Yeah, I mean, like electric garden city. What are your thoughts on like Welwyn Garden City, for example? Like, you know, the way you have to have a certain parameter of land between the road and like the house, and then something like that. Like your thoughts on that? Could that be a potential look back and then develop?
I mean, this is way outside my expertise, but my personal feeling about them is that they were in their time fairly revolutionary, and that they have presumably had a huge influence on town planning since, and that most of the general principles of garden cities seem to be now sort of generally accepted within planning. I don't know whether that's right. I mean, I actually live bang next door to New Earswick, which is the Rowntree village in York. And which is unique. I mean, it was built in 1904, I think they started. It was to provide, I mean, you know, Rowntree's was a Quaker firm, so they had very strong principles. It didn't quite extend as far as worrying where they got their cocoa from, but anyway. But they did have strong principles about their workforce in the UK, at least. And so they built something that was meant to be, you know, pleasant to live in. And there's no pub, for example. Nor is there a church. They wouldn't have either of those in the village, which is very interesting. There is a Quaker meeting house, but what's interesting is that all the houses have pedestrian access on one side, at least. So there are these pedestrian ways all the way through. This is in 1904, when there were no cars. So presumably the problem then was worrying about horses coming down the moon or something like that. I don't know. But it is striking, and it works brilliantly to this day. I mean, it's really attractive to walk through and to admire. I think the roots of this go back a very long way. And there is no question that if I had a choice of living in one of those streets I showed a photograph of in London or in Welwyn Garden City, I would choose Welwyn Garden City every time. I mean, the concrete deserts are not attractive. So I think the answer is go for it. I mean, the problem, of course, straightforwardly, I understand, is that the population density immediately falls. So you need a greater area of land, and then instantly you come up with the problem of, well, you're taking land away from other purposes. So I do understand the conflict that lies behind it, but it's up to you lot. You're the architects. You sort it, please.
Thank you.
Quickly on that, where this is more personal. Where do you live, and why have you chosen to live there?
Where do I live?
Yes.
I live in what was once a village called Huntington, which is now a suburb of York, and it's the other side of a mighty river called the Foss, which is a large drainage ditch, basically, from New Earswick. So I look across from my garden to New Earswick. So that's where I live. Why did I choose to live there? Because I moved to York in 1972. Yes, I know it's a very long time ago. And the only place I could afford to live. And I'm still here.
There must be other reasons why you're still there, but I like that as an answer.
Shadan has got a question. Do you want to come? Question seat.
Hot seat.
Hello. I just had a question regarding the land that we obviously have naturally being introduced for green spaces. What your opinion was?
So background noise. I'm not sure what it is, but I can't hear anything.
I just wanted to ask your opinion on the introduction of biophilic design and how, basically, what your opinion is on green spaces being introduced inside buildings in central cities, for example, that don't have as much green space available. Sorry,
I'm really sorry about this, but there's interference or background noise or something. I can't actually understand the question. It's not your fault, it's mine. But
okay.
Maybe right up to the camera, that would work. Yeah.
I'm just going to come up to the screen. My question was basically what your opinion was on cities, for example, London, who don't always necessarily have space in the central cities. Obviously, they have Hampstead Heath and that sort of thing. But what about like central cities where there isn't a lot of green space? And what your opinion is on them introducing green spaces into office buildings and like residential buildings internally rather than externally?
You call it biophilic
design. Yes.
Internally, in the sense that you would put a sort of atrium in the middle with things, plants in it or something, or roof gardens. I'm not sure I'm not enough of an architect. I'm not anything of an architect to know what that means. How do you introduce greenery into a building?
So in some cases, they're introducing it in atrium spaces, or instead of typical office spaces where it's just a room, they'll introduce a green space, like a winter garden area, and that would be the office space. Or like in residential buildings, rather than it being a concrete building, they'll introduce green planting on the exterior and interior, like social hub spaces. Basically my question is, would you see that as a replacement for what we don't necessarily have in very built up areas, or would it be better off to go back to the original natural green spaces by demolishing areas, is my question.
Okay, it's really interesting. I think if there's the opportunity to demolish, I think once you can reduce density of buildings, that improves things hugely. But it's perfectly understandable that opportunity may not be appropriate. I think my starting point would be to see what nature will just do. I think these highly engineered solutions are dangerous. The sustaining them and maintaining them is difficult. You have to ask where, I mean, a plant normally grows in soil, receives water from rainfall or infiltration, uses light which comes naturally from the sun, etc., etc. Once you start trying to grow plants in funny places, you're engineering the solution in some way. And I think that's a dangerous way forward. I personally would try to avoid it. I'd try to design architectures which enable plants just to grow. And I actually don't really like the idea of tree planting and things like that. There's a huge push at the moment nationally for massive tree planting. And it totally baffles me because the people pushing it seem to fail to notice that for the last 400 million years, trees have been planting themselves and growing very happily without us providing them with tubes and planting them in straight lines. And I don't understand why we can't just let things go. And I would argue that your starting point in trying to make a greener city was to let nature have space in some way and see what it does with it. If it does things which are actually really unsuitable, then maybe you have to intervene. But generally speaking, it will do something interesting and usually attractive. And it will be minimal maintenance and it will be more successful. So that would be my starting point. Where I would end up, I've absolutely no idea.
What do you think about the roof garden or planting on the roof of building?
I think, well, if people want to, I mean, there's a big push for green roofs, and fine. I'm very comfortable with green roofs. I think they're a good idea. I understand that they can be quite good for keeping buildings cool, and if that's true, that's a very good thing to do. They're pretty strange things, really. Because as soon as you get a serious drought, somebody's got to water them. Unless you're just doing stone crops and things like that. I mean, there are succulent systems for green roofs, which probably make more sense. But the sort of green roofs, which are sort of turf, sort of meadow on the roof type thing. Well, I've seen them in Iceland. They look fantastic, but it rains all the time, so you don't have to worry about that side of it. You try and do it in the climate, you try and do it in London, where you could quite happily get 7 or 8 weeks without a drop of rain. Inevitably, it's all going to die unless you have a watering system, and you're back to engineering then. So I would again say, if you can avoid the engineering, you would. But that would be my take.
One subject we haven't at all addressed is the...
Sorry?
One subject we haven't yet addressed is the issue of domestic animals and plants. In other words, nature which is at the outset in a collaborative situation with humans. And I wonder whether you have a view about this as an ecologist. Your father included some illustrations of domesticated plants, for instance, which in turn attracted wild insects and so on. But how one might make domesticated species, how one might place them in this picture of the relationship between what we do as humans and what nature does on its own?
There is, in fact, a continuum between fully domesticated and fully wild creatures. So, I mean, though some things, like, dogs and cats, we think of as being wholly domesticated, but the feral cat population in this country is huge. So cats are actually just as much wild animals as they are domesticated animals. And it's also true that among plants, I mean, most of the dangerous invasive plant species there are in this country were brought in as garden plants. So Himalayan balsam, these wonderful descriptions in 19th century nurserymen's catalogues saying what a spectacular plant it is, and every garden should have it. And indeed, every garden does have it, probably, whether it likes it or not. You certainly wouldn't be able to sell it now, anyway. I think that would be a difficult marketing thing. But so, in a sense, I don't see a distinction. I mean, there are some animals have been incredibly clever. Some plants have been incredibly clever at becoming indispensable to us, as it were. Right. So they've gone one step beyond being really good at living with us to being, well, in case of cats, they sort of they own us in some sense. I mean, cats have it all ways. I mean, a domestic cat is in many cases free to come and go and be a wild animal if it chooses, or it can come in and get fed if it chooses. So it's really, it's hard to see the distinction between that and a wild animal which is just choosing. Your house is part of its habitat, that it's colonized very effectively. So I don't think there's a big distinction.
Fascinating. And how about cows?
Cows are another incredibly successful animal because they have made themselves indispensable to us, apparently, though they may be facing a comeuppance, actually, because there is there's now a recognition that they are perhaps not the best things for us to have in the quantities we have them. And you only have to go to a supermarket to see the array of non-dairy milks that's available now to realize that people are beginning to move away from that lifestyle. I suspect that in 30 years' time, cows will be relatively rare creatures in the landscape. They'll be there because there'll be a premium market for them, but I don't believe for a moment that we'll see cows in the numbers we currently see them. But they're very clever.
Not as clever as a chicken. So.
The chickens are the cleverest of all. Well, the cats are the cleverest of all. The cats have really got it made.
It's quite clear that we're quite far down the pecking order there.
Oh, we are. Yeah. We think of ourselves as top dogs, but we're not.
We're in fact everybody's servant. But
yep. We just think because we eat them that therefore we're on top, but it's not true.
Alastair, would you be willing to develop that point? Because that's an intriguing one. Where are we in the pecking order?
Oh, right. No, I'm not going to be precise on that one. I think some of us are in a different position in the pecking order than others, anyway.
Well, if it's a pecking order, then the chicken is definitely high up there because they've chosen.
They invented it.
Alastair, can I ask a question related to our project, which is in Tolwas? It's essentially we're dealing with suburban sort of settings, and I don't know if you have any views in terms of ecology or naturalist point of view on suburb generally.
One of the strange things is that the suburbs are now among the most wildlife-rich parts of the world, of the country. It's a really odd thing. I mean, most of the agricultural landscape is now basically a biological desert, particularly the arable landscape. But even grazing areas are pretty poor. Suburbs, because of the intensity of gardening, provide a wide range of habitats and food sources for a wide range of species. So we actually get a pretty impressive collection of species. And there are quite a few schemes to record that. And we know it's true because there's the garden bird scheme, the garden moth scheme, and there's a whole series of these schemes where people record what they see in their gardens. So we actually have data on that. It's not just anecdotal. So they are actually extraordinarily rich. They could be a lot richer. And they are rich at a cost as well. So that many gardens are intensively managed. One might say overmanaged, but that would be a value judgment. But they are certainly intensively managed with incredibly short mown grass, which is mown on a regular cycle, with veg patches which are sprayed with herbicides and insecticides and fungicides and Lord knows what else, poisoning the people who eat them for reasons that are best known to themselves. You know, and all those plants being grown in peat compost, which results in the destruction of huge areas of peat bog. I mean, there's a lot of environmental issues about gardening, and of course the fact that there are something like, I mean, there are about 1,500 species of native plant in this country. There's about another 200 which have been introduced and have become fully established and are part of the natural flora. There are something like 50,000 species of plants grown in gardens. So there's several, more than one order of magnitude, more plants in gardens, more different species than there are growing wild. And very rough, I mean, a colleague and I, mainly his work, did this years ago. We looked at the probability of a plant or any organism becoming established. If it was introduced into a new country, what was the chance of it creating an established population somewhere? Or, actually, what was the chance of it just occurring in the wild, escaping in some way from a garden or whatever? Roughly 10%. And then we asked what was the probability that ones that escaped in some way would become fully established. And again, it was roughly 10%. And then we asked what was the probability of something that became established becoming a pest. Again, it was roughly 10%. We call this the tens rule. And what it tells you is that 0.1% of the things you introduced are going to become a real problem. And that's fine until you start introducing tens of thousands of things, in which case you're guaranteeing some problems. And indeed, we have problems. So we have a number of plant pests which have appeared in recent years, a number of tree diseases. I mean, ash dieback is the most recent, which is, I don't know what it's like down in London, but up here it's terrible. The Dutch elm disease before that, back in the 70s and 80s, which, when I grew up, you went anywhere in England and the countryside tree was an elm. You just don't see them at all these days. They've gone without trace. I mean, they're still there, actually. They're in hedges as suckers, but they can never turn into a tree because they get destroyed as soon as they try. And there are things, there are insects coming in. There's this emerald ash borer, which is about to appear in this country, which is likely to cause further damage to the ashes. So if the ash dieback doesn't get it, the emerald ash borer will, and so on. There's a whole range of these things. The Asian hornet is another one which has arrived. They're desperately trying to control it, but it's around and is a major potential problem. So these things will arrive, and a tiny fraction of them will become real problems for us. But because we're importing things at such a huge rate, and the horticulture industry is the worst culprit on this, that we are guaranteeing problems for the future.
Right.
Not sure that answers your question, but still.
No, it's a great question. The great answer, yes. Basically, yes. We have quite a lot of potentials, as well as potential problems. There's a few questions, quite simple ones. Do you see humans as invasive species?
It depends what you mean by an invasive species. So if you remove the value judgments from it, and you simply say that an invasive species is one that is good at colonizing new habitats, and the answer is indubitably yes. But the problem is that the word invasive has come to mean bad. And it's usually associated with an even worse word, alien. So you get botanists are the worst at this. They talk about invasive alien species, which I think, oh God, this is the 21st century. Can we please find some new words? But if you're going to remove the value judgment from invasive, then I think it's indubitably the case. We're good at invading. We're good at colonizing new habitats. So we are in more habitats than almost any other species. The exception probably being the rat or the house mouse, or maybe the human flea, possibly. But anyway.
Okay. Another question is: can an architect be a naturalist?
Please, yes, please do. Why not? What would possibly stop an architect wanting to know about the natural world? A naturalist is merely somebody who takes an interest in and has enthusiasm for the natural world, that's all. And architects ought to be naturalists, I would say.
Yep, no, I would say so too. Right.
Whether naturalists ought to be architects is another question.
We have 5 more minutes.
Enough of those.
Yeah.
Not quite.
Yeah, even any comments, anything? No? No? Laura, do you have anything? No?
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, Shadan wants to question.
Sorry, just one more question. I know you said that engineering nature isn't necessarily the best, but I did have another example that I just wanted to ask. What's your opinion on buildings that are now being, there's some research being done how buildings can be manufactured out of trees, so trees being like manipulated as they grow to form like outer shells for buildings. What your opinion was on that?
Gosh, I'm not sure I have one. So this is the idea that you prefab a building.
Yeah, there's some research being done in some universities in America. There's a professor who's trying to basically she's designing essentially frames for how a tree can be manipulated into forming a shell, and then the walls would be created. I'm not sure what the walls would be created out of. It's more the frame of the building would be made from the tree.
Made from what, sorry?
From trees. So as the tree grows, it would be formed into the shape of the frame. So it'd be like a living building, essentially.
So actually, it's wood and it's growing.
Yes. So it'd be a tree that grows constantly as the building is used.
It sounds very exciting. I can't see it being a solution to many problems, but and you would be it would be a bit of a problem if you made your building out of ash and then you got ash dieback. But I just think it sounds fun. There's a guy who makes furniture that way, isn't there?
Yeah.
He grows trees and then contorts them into funny shapes. But I think in order to sit on the chair, he has to chop it down and sell it to you. I don't think you have it growing in your sitting room.
We have another question.
If you want to come closer.
Yeah. Hi. So I just had a question about like the human involvement in the kind of focus towards preserving nature in general. So just going back in time when destruction or human inhabitation did start, obviously there were a lot of species that got affected negatively, but also species that did get affected positively. So I just wonder, what sort of involvement should humans have to kind of not have a negative impact on the species that did actually benefit from human involvement? Should we just try and maintain where we are, or should we try and not rewild, but wild again, as you said?
Well, species that benefit from our activities are going to benefit from our activities, so that we don't have to worry about them too much. Species that don't benefit fall into two categories, I think. There are those which are actively inimical to us as we see it. So people don't like the idea of having bears in the countryside because they're afraid that they'll get eaten by a bear. But the vast majority of species that suffer from our activities are not in that category at all. They're plants and insects and things like that, which just lose their habitat. The main problem is habitat loss and habitat degradation. And I think we should go out of our way to try and minimize our footprint on the natural world in that way. I think the issue about the things that are potentially dangerous, I'm not sure how dangerous they are in many cases, is a different one and a much more difficult one. I mean, there's a strong movement for rewilding, as they call it, for bringing back things. I think, you know, you can go all the way in that from beavers, which is a no-brainer, and we should have them everywhere, to lynx, which I think is a really good idea, but would be difficult to persuade people of, to wolves, which I think is a fantastic idea, will be impossible to persuade people of, to bear, which I just think is balmy. You know, after the bear, do you go for rhinoceros, which after all, the rhinoceros is a perfectly good part of the fauna of this country once upon a time. You know, we have to recognise this is a small island with a very large human population, and it's not obvious to me what bear would do that would be hugely beneficial. Whereas actually, though I don't think it'll ever happen, wolves would be hugely beneficial because you wouldn't get the problem in Scotland at the moment of deer populations going out through the roof. So I think there's some complex questions in there, which, yeah, require another seminar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My favourite story on that is the eagle that used to eat moa. So the moa was a giant flightless bird in New Zealand, and the eagle went extinct, as did the moa, very shortly after the Maori arrived in the 14th century. And it's thought, the eagle went extinct quite a bit before the moa, it's thought that the eagles failed to notice that the Maori were not just moa. And so they started attacking moa and the Maori, and the Maori probably thought these eagles are a bad idea.